I went into the woods alone in late September because I needed quiet more than anything else. Work had been grinding me down for months, and I had a long weekend with no plans. I picked a state forest a few hours from home. Nothing famous, nothing dramatic. Just miles of mixed hardwoods, old logging roads, and shallow hills. I had been there once before years ago, and it felt empty in a right way. No cell service, no crowds, no cabins nearby. I wanted to walk, camp, and sleep without hearing engines or voices. I parked at a gravel pull-off near an unmarked trailhead. There was no gate, no sign, just a narrow dirt track disappearing into the trees. The air already smelled like wet leaves and cold soil. Fall had started to take over, but the trees were still mostly green. I checked my pack, locked my car, and started walking in. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed sparse. The forest felt thick, like it swallowed sound instead of echoing it. After about 3 miles, I left the trail and followed an old logging road that barely showed on my map. It was grown over with grass and ferns, with tire ruts sunk deep and filled with dark water. I like places like that. It meant no recent traffic. I found a flat spot near a small creek and set up my tent before dark. Everything felt normal. I cooked a simple meal, watched the light fade through the trees, and crawled into my sleeping bag early. The woods went still in that heavy way they do at night, not silent, just muted. Sometime after midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. I lay still listening. The creek was still running. The wind was light. Then I heard something slow and deliberate moving through leaves somewhere uphill from my camp. It was not an animal running or foraging. It was steady, measured, and heavy enough to compress the ground. I told myself it could be a deer, but the pattern did not fit. It stopped, waited, then moved again. I stayed still until the sound drifted farther away. I did not sleep much after that. In the morning, I tried to shake off the feeling. I packed my food away, checked the area, and saw nothing out of place. No clear tracks, no broken branches. Still, the air felt wrong, like I was being watched. I decided to hike farther in instead of leaving. I convinced myself that if someone else was out there, moving away from roads would make it less likely to cross paths. That logic felt solid at the time. As the day went on, the forest changed. The logging road narrowed and finally vanished. The trees grew closer together, and the ground sloped down into a wide hollow. I started noticing small signs that did not belong. Old plastic bottles half buried in leaves. Strips of faded caution tape tied to branches, not marking a trail, just hanging loose. A rusted oil drum lying on its side, black stains leaking into the soil. None of it looked recent, but none of it felt accidental either. Around mid-afternoon, I smelled something sharp and chemical, faint but noticeable. It did not belong in the woods. It burned the back of my throat when the wind shifted just right. I slowed down and paid closer attention to my surroundings. The forest floor showed more disturbance here. Flattened leaves, snapped twigs, paths that were not trails, but had been walked enough times to be obvious if you looked for them. I started feeling that pressure again, the sense of being observed. Every time I stopped, the woods felt too still, like everything was waiting. I told myself to turn back, but I kept going, driven by a mix of curiosity and stubbornness. That was my biggest mistake. I found a clearing by accident. The trees opened up around a shallow pit dug into the ground. Tarps were stretched between trunks, sagging under rainwater and leaves. There were piles of scrap metal, hoses, and empty containers stacked in a way that was too organized to be trash. This was not an abandoned campsite. This was a working place, or it had been recently. My chest tightened, and I backed away slowly, careful not to make noise. That was when I heard movement behind me, much closer than before. Leaves shifted, weight settled. I did not turn around. I stood there, frozen, every muscle tight, listening to my own breathing grow too loud in my ears. The sound moved again, circling, not rushing. I took a step back, then another. A branch snapped under my heel, sharp and loud. The movement behind me stopped. The silence that followed felt intentional. I turned and started walking fast, then faster, following no clear direction, just away. I did not run at first, trying to keep control, but the sense of pursuit pushed me into it. I heard footsteps behind me now, matching my pace, not gaining, not falling back. Whoever was knew the terrain. I did not. I tripped and went down hard, scraping my hands and knees. I got back up without stopping, adrenaline burning through everything. My pack bounced against my shoulders. My lungs burned. The woods blurred past, branches tearing at my clothes. I did not look back again. Eventually, the ground sloped sharply downward, and I slid more than ran, catching myself on trees, nearly falling again. I heard the footsteps fade, then stop entirely. I did not slow down. I kept moving until my legs felt weak and my head spun. I ended up near the creek again, though I did not recognize it first. I followed the water downstream, using it as a guide, forcing myself to calm down enough to think. I did not go back to my campsite. I did not care about my tent or gear anymore. I just wanted out. It took hours. Darkness came, and I kept moving, guided by the sound of water and the faint memory of the land. When I finally saw the gravel road, it felt unreal. My car was still there, untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for a long time before I could drive. I did not go to the authorities right away. I told myself I had no proof, no clear location, nothing solid. A few days later, I saw a local news article about an illegal operation discovered deep in that same forest after hikers reported strange smells and activity. The photos showed the same tarps, the same pit, the same clutter of equipment I'd seen. The article mentioned arrests and dangerous chemicals. Reading that, everything clicked into place. The footsteps, the waiting, the way I had been allowed to run instead of chased down. I had wandered somewhere I was not supposed to be, and someone had decided scaring me off was safer than letting me see too much. I have not gone camping alone since. When I think about that trip, what stays with me is not the running or the fear, but the calm control of whoever was back there. The woods did not scare me on their own. It was the fact that someone else was using them as cover, watching, deciding what to do with me, and choosing, for reasons I will never know, to let me leave. I went into the woods because I needed distance from people and noise, not because I was brave or looking for trouble. It was late September, the kind of time when the air turned sharp in the mornings and the leaves start drying out under your boots. I had taken a few days off work and decided to camp alone in a stretch of state forest I had hiked before. It was familiar enough that I felt comfortable, but remote enough that I knew I would not see many people. That balance mattered to me. I packed light, but not careless. Tent, food, water filter, headlamp, extra batteries, a knife, a basic first aid kit. I left my phone in airplane mode to save battery and told myself that if anything happened, I could hike out the same way I came in. The trailhead parking area was empty when I arrived. No fresh tire marks, no trash, no sound except wind moving through the trees. I locked my car and stood there for a moment, listening. The woods felt calm in that steady, watchful way they sometimes do. I followed the trail for a few miles until it narrowed and faded into a less used path. I knew this section well. I had marked a small clearing near a creek on a previous hike and planned to camp there again. The ground was flat and the tree cover was thick enough to block wind. As I walked, I noticed how dry everything was. Leaves crunched loudly under each step. Fallen branches snapped instead of bending. The sound carried farther than I liked. It made me feel exposed, like anything nearby could track my movement without trying. I brushed that thought away and kept going. I reached the clearing in the early afternoon and set up camp. The creek was lower than last time, water sliding over rocks instead of rushing. I filtered water, ate a late lunch, and sat for a while watching light move through the trees. The first strange thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something sour mixed with rot. At first, I thought it was a dead animal somewhere downwind. That is not unusual in the woods. I moved my camp a little farther from the creek, thinking maybe something had washed up nearby. The smell faded, and I stopped thinking about it. As the sun dropped lower, the woods changed the way they always do. Shadows stretched and blended together. The sound shifted, birds quieted down, replaced by insects and the soft knock of branches rubbing against each other. I cooked dinner before it got dark and cleaned up carefully, hanging my food bag from a tree away from camp. I checked my surroundings more than usual, scanning between trunks, listening for footsteps that did not match the normal rhythm of the forest. Everything sounded normal. Wind, leaves, water, nothing else. I went to sleep early. The ground was hard, but I was tired enough that it did not matter. Sometime during the night, I woke up with the feeling that something was wrong. Not a noise, not a dream, just a sense of pressure like the air had thickened. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No insects, no distant animal sounds. Just nothing. Then I heard movement. Slow, uneven steps somewhere off to my left. Not the quick darting of a deer or the light scuffle of a raccoon. This was heavier, deliberate. I held my breath and waited. The steps stopped. After a long pause, they started again, closer this time. I could hear leaves shifting, branches snapping softly under weight. Whatever was moved around my camp, not straight toward it, but in a wide arc. I stayed still for a long time. Eventually the sounds faded. The normal night, noises slowly returned. I told myself it was probably an animal passing through. Still, I did not sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked the ground around my camp. The leaves made it hard to see clear prints, but I noticed disturbed patches where the leaf cover had been pushed aside. The marks were not clear enough to identify, but they were too spread out to belong to a deer. They looked careless, like whoever or whatever made them did not care about hiding their path. I felt uneasy, but not panicked. I told myself I was overthinking it. I decided to hike deeper that day, following the creek upstream. The trail was faint, but still visible. As I walked, I noticed more signs of disturbance. Broken branches at shoulder height, scratches on tree bark that did not match claw marks, pieces of trash half buried in leaves, old food wrappers, rusted cans, things that had been there a while. That told me people had been through here more often than I thought. By early afternoon, I found something that made my stomach tighten. About 20 yards off the path, there was a rough shelter made of branches and plastic sheeting. It was low to the ground and blended into the undergrowth. From a distance, it almost looked natural. Up close, it was clear someone had built it. Inside, there was old bedding, darkened by dirt and moisture. Empty bottles, a stained backpack. The smell from a night before was stronger here. I backed away slowly. I did not touch anything. I did not stay long enough to examine details. I felt watched, even though I could not see anyone. The woods around the shelter felt different, tense, like sound did not travel right. I returned to my camp faster than I meant to, constantly checking behind me. When I got back, something was wrong. My tent flap was open. I was sure I closed it. Inside, my sleeping bag was disturbed. My pack had been moved. Nothing was missing, but had been gone through. That realization hit harder than anything else so far. Someone had been in my camp while I was gone. Someone had touched my things. I packed up immediately. My hands shook as I worked, making careless mistakes, dropping items, rechecking straps. I kept my head up, scanning the trees, listening for movement. The forest was loud again, but it felt fake, like noise meant to cover other sounds. I slung my pack on and started back the way I came. The trail felt longer than it had before. Every sound made me tense. Several times, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I never saw anyone, but the sense of being followed grew stronger the farther I went. About a mile from the trailhead, the path narrowed between dense brush. Visibility dropped. The smell returned, stronger than before. I saw fresh disturbances in the leaves, pressed down recently. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I broke into a fast walk, then a jog, ignoring the noise I made. That was when I saw him. He was standing just off the trail, partially hidden by a tree. Thin, dirty. His clothes hung loose, torn and dark with grime. His face was streaked with something dried and dark that might have been blood or dirt. His eyes were fixed on me. He did not move. He did not try to hide. He just watched. I froze for a second too long. Then I moved. I ran. Branches slapped my arms and face. My pack bounced painfully against my back. I heard movement behind me. Faster now, no longer trying to stay quiet. I did not look back again. I reached the parking area in a blind rush and nearly tripped on the pavement. My car was still there. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up, unlocked the door, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors and sat there shaking, gasping for air. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I did not see anyone emerge from the trees. Eventually, my breathing slowed enough that I could drive. I left without looking back. Later, after I was safe and far away, the fear settled into something heavier. I realized how close I had come to being trapped, how easily someone could have waited until night, until I was asleep, until there was nowhere to run. The woods had not been haunted or cursed. They had been occupied. Someone had claimed that space and did not want to be seen. I never went back to that forest. I reported what I found, though I do not know if anything came of it. What stayed with me was not the image of the man, but the memory of how quiet the woods became that first night, like they were holding their breath, waiting for me to understand that I was not alone. I went camping with 3 friends in October of 2014 because we wanted one last trip before winter closed everything down. We were all in our early 20s, working jobs that kept us indoors, and we wanted cold air, fire smoke, and a few days without phones. We chose Western Pennsylvania, an area none of us knew well, but that one of my friends had heard about through co-workers. It sat near an old strip mine that had been abandoned decades earlier and had grown back over the years. The land was unofficial. There were no marked campsites or signs. Locals used it because no one bothered them there. We parked near an abandoned access road that cut through the trees like a scar. The pavement was broken and half covered by dirt and weeds. We hiked in about 2 miles, following a faint trail that drifted in and out of view. The forest was mixed hardwood, oak and maple with patches of pine. Fallen leaves covered everything and softened our steps. The air smelled dry and clean, with that sharp edge that only comes in autumn. The first night was normal. We set up tents in a clearing that looked used but not maintained. There were old fire rings and flattened ground. We cooked over a fire, drank more than we should have, and stayed up late telling stories. Nothing felt wrong. The woods were calm. The sounds were familiar. Wind moved through the trees. Small animals rustled in the leaves. We slept well. The second day was colder. Frost clung to the shaded ground in the morning and melted slowly. We spent the day hiking deeper into the area, following old paths that may have once been used by miners or hunters. The strip mine itself was farther off, hidden behind regrowth and uneven land. You could still see unnatural slopes and long flat cuts in the hills if you knew what to look for. That was when we found the structure. It sat off the side of a faint trail, half hidden by brush. At first glance, it looked like a hunting shack, the kind people build from scrap wood and leave to rot. The roof sagged. One wall leaned inward. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. We stepped closer out of curiosity. Inside, the place was torn up in a way that did not make sense. Deep scratches covered the walls, long and uneven, carved into the wood at different heights. Some ran straight, others curved. They overlapped each other again and again, like something had been dragged back and forth repeatedly. The floor was gouged. Splinters littered the ground. There was no furniture, no bedding, nothing left behind that showed someone lived there recently. The scratches were too deep to be from normal wear. They were not from knives or tools. They were wider than that. The pattern felt frantic, not controlled. The smell inside was old and stale, with a hint of rot. No one wanted to stay near it. We stood there longer than necessary, trying to understand what we were looking at, then turned back toward camp without saying much. The walk back felt longer. The woods seemed tighter, the trees closer together. Light filtered down in thin bands. I kept thinking about the marks on the walls and how high some of them reached. We told ourselves it was probably animals trapped inside at some point. Bears scratch wood. People do strange things in isolated places. None of those explanations settled fully. That night, the temperature dropped fast after sunset. We built the fire higher and stayed close to it. The forest beyond the light felt heavier than the night before. The dark pressed in, thick and complete. Then the first rock came flying into the clearing. It landed near the fire with a sharp crack, bouncing once before stopping. It came from the tree, but we could not tell where. A few seconds passed. Then another rock came from a different direction. It hit farther back, near one of the tents. This was not random. The timing was spaced out. One rock at a time, always from a new angle. We froze, listening. No laughter followed. No footsteps rushed away. Just the quiet woods and the crack of stone on dirt. We turned off our lights and let the fire burn lower. The clearing fell into shadow. The rocks kept coming. Each one felt deliberate. They landed close, but never hit anyone. The sound of them striking the ground felt louder in the dark. Leaves shifted somewhere just beyond the edge of the firelight. At one point, I heard heavy breathing close by. It came from low to the ground, slow and steady, close enough that I could hear air moving in and out. The sound did not move toward us. It stayed just out of view. Nothing stepped fully into the light. The breathing faded, then returned from another spot. The rocks continued for nearly an hour. No one spoke. No one moved. We stayed still, letting the fire die down until it was little more than glowing coals. Eventually, the rocks stopped. The woods did not return to normal right away. Silence held for a long time before small sounds crept back in. None of us slept much. Morning light felt thin and weak. The clearing looked smaller in daylight. We stepped carefully around the camp and saw the footprints. They circled the tents and the fire ring. The prints were deep and wide, pressed into damp soil and leaves. They did not look human. The shape was wrong. The heel was too broad. The front spread wide, with impressions that suggested toes, but not in a way we could easily count. They did not match deer or bear tracks we had seen before. The stride was uneven, sometimes long, sometimes short, as if the thing had shifted its weight often. We packed up quickly. No one suggested staying another night. We hiked out without talking much, listening to every sound behind us. The forest did not follow. The access road came into view, and relief washed over us all at once. For a long time, none of us talked about that trip. When we did, years later, we tried to make sense of it. Western Pennsylvania has wildlife people underestimate. Black bears move through reclaimed land. Coyotes and feral dogs roam old mining areas. Bears can throw rocks, especially when bluffing or testing threats. They circle camps. They breathe heavy. A bear, standing upright, can leave prints that look wrong when pressed into soft ground and leaves. Old structures attract animals seeking shelter, and a trapped or stressed bear can tear wood apart with repeated scratching. The strip mine explained the terrain and the strange paths. The unofficial camps explained why someone might build a shack and then abandon it. The reclaimed land funneled animals into narrow corridors. A bear accustomed to people, but not afraid of them, could have watched us, testing boundaries without attacking. That explanation fits well enough to let me sleep now. What stays with me is not fear of something unknown, but how calm and controlled the situation felt from the other side. Whatever circled us that night did not want to fight. It wanted space. It used noise and pressure to make that clear. We listened. We left. None of us went back there again. Not because the woods were haunted or cursed, but because we learned how quickly familiar ground can remind you that you are not in charge out there, no matter how normal the first night feels. I went into the woods because I needed quiet and because I trusted routine more than judgment. I had done this kind of trip many times before, short solo hikes with one overnight camp, nothing extreme. This forest sat several miles outside a small rural town, not remote enough to be wild, but far enough that most people stayed near the marked trails. It was early October. The weather was stable. No rain expected. Cool days, cold nights. I parked at a gravel pull-off that served as an unofficial trailhead. There were no other cars. That did not bother me. It usually looked like that on weekdays. The trail followed an old logging road for the first mile. It was wide, packed dirt with grass growing in the center. Tire ruts had been filled by leaves. The woods were dense on both sides. Tall pines mixed with hardwoods that were already dropping leaves. The ground was dry. Every step made noise. I remember thinking I should have brought softer boots. Sound carried in a way that made me feel visible. After the road narrowed into a footpath, I checked my map and compass. I planned to camp near a low ridge above a creek. I had been there once before. I left the main trail and followed a faint side path that curved uphill. It was still easy walking but less traveled. Broken branches crossed the path. Brush pressed in closer. I slowed down and paid attention to the ground so I would not twist an ankle. About halfway up the ridge, I noticed the first sign that someone else had been there recently. A boot print pressed into a soft patch of dirt near a fallen log. It was clear with a sharp heel edge. Not old. The soil was still dark where it had been compressed. I stopped and looked around. The woods were quiet but not silent. Wind moved the tops of the trees. A bird shifted somewhere behind me. Nothing else stood out. I told myself it could have been another hiker. There were no rules against camping out here. Still, the direction of the print pointed away from the main trail deeper into the woods. That made me uneasy. Most people did not go that way unless they knew where they were going. I continued upward and reached the ridge by early afternoon. The ground leveled out, covered in needles and dry leaves. The creek below was visible through gaps in the trees. I chose a spot with natural cover and cleared just enough debris to set my tent. While I worked, I kept stopping to listen. Nothing sounded close. I finished setting up, filtered water, and ate a simple meal. As the light shifted, the forest changed tone. Shadows thickened between the trees. The temperature dropped faster than I expected. I put on an extra layer and walked a short distance away from camp to use the bathroom. That was when I noticed the smell. It was faint but sharp, like spoiled food mixed with damp fabric. I followed it for a few steps, then stopped. It seemed to come from downhill, not far from where the slope dropped toward the creek. I decided not to investigate. I returned to camp and told myself the smell could carry from anywhere. Night came quickly. The woods grew louder at first, then slowly quieter. Insects slowed. The wind dropped. I sat inside my tent with my headlamp off, listening. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. After a while, I lay down and closed my eyes. I woke up to movement. Not sound at first, just the sense that something had changed. I opened my eyes and stayed still. Then I heard it. Slow steps on dry leaves. Careful, uneven, not circling like an animal, moving with intention. The steps stopped for long stretches, then started again. They were not heavy, but they were controlled. I counted my breaths and tried to stay calm. The steps moved closer, then paused. I could hear the soft scrape of fabric brushing against bark. The sound came from behind my tent near the tree line. I stayed still for what felt like a long time. Eventually, the movement faded. I did not hear it leave, only that it was no longer close. I did not sleep after that. I watched the faint light shift through the tent walls until morning. At first light, I checked the ground around my camp. The leaves were disturbed in several places, pressed down in fresh patches. The pattern was not random. It stopped just short of my tent and then moved away downhill. I followed the marks for a few yards and then stopped. The smell from the night before was stronger now. It led toward a cluster of trees where the ground dipped sharply. I packed my bag slowly. I considered leaving right then, but part of me wanted to understand what was nearby. The thought did not feel smart, but it felt honest. I followed the disturbed leaves downhill, moving carefully, stopping often to listen. About 30 yards from my camp, I found a makeshift shelter. It was built low to the ground between fallen logs. Branches and bark were layered over a frame of sticks. Pieces of plastic and fabric were woven in. Inside, there was bedding made from old clothes and leaves. Empty cans, food wrappers, a stained blanket. Everything smelled stale and sour. What caught my attention most was how organized it was. Items were arranged, not scattered. This was not temporary. Someone lived here. I backed away without touching anything. As I turned, I noticed something else. A narrow path led away from the shelter, pressed into the leaves. It ran uphill, not toward my camp, but parallel to it. I realized then that whoever lived there could see my campsite from a distance. I returned to my tent and packed the rest of my gear fast. My hands shook. I dropped things and had to force myself to slow down. When I finished, I stood still for a moment and listened. The woods felt wrong, too still. I started back the way I came, keeping my pace steady. After a few minutes, I heard movement behind me. leaves shifting in a rhythm that matched mine. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. I did not look back. I focused on the path ahead and kept walking. The sound stayed with me for nearly a mile. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Never rushing, never falling behind. My legs burned, but I did not break into a run. I knew the trail narrowed ahead. I wanted space if I needed it. Near the edge of the logging road, the sound stopped. I waited. Nothing followed. I stepped onto the wider path and increased my pace. I did not relax until I saw my car through the trees. I reached the gravel pull-off and unlocked my door. Before getting in, I turned and looked back toward the woods. That was when I saw him. He stood just inside the tree line, partly hidden by a trunk. Thin, dirty. His clothes hung loose. His face was still, eyes fixed on me. He did not move forward. He did not retreat. He simply watched. I got in my car and locked the doors. I waited with the engine running. He did not come closer. After several minutes, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I drove away and did not stop until I reached town. Later, I reported what I found. I described the shelter and the location. I did not know what happened after that. What stayed with me was not the fear in the moment, but the understanding that the woods had not been empty. I had walked into someone else's space without knowing it. The sounds at night, the smell, the careful steps, all of it made sense once I understood that someone had been watching me the entire time. I do not camp alone anymore. When I think about that trip, I remember how close routine came to turning into a mistake. The forest did not try to scare me. It simply revealed what was already there. I went into the woods because my father had just died and I did not know how to sit still anymore. The house felt wrong after the funeral. Every room held its shape. The quiet pressed in harder than any noise. I needed movement and cold air, and something that did not care whether I was broken. Late March of 2016 was raw in eastern Kentucky, the kind of damp that seeps into bones. I drove east toward the edge of Daniel Boone National Forest, following roads I had known since I was a kid. I was 27 then, old enough to know better and young enough to think familiarity could protect me. I parked my truck at an old gravel turnout I had used since my teenage years. The place had no sign, just a widening in the road where logging trucks once turned around. I took my pack and followed the creek upstream. That path had always been reliable, climbing just enough to stay above flood level. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my boots sank deeper than usual. The woods felt heavier that day. Fog sat low between the trees even after noon, clinging to the hollows and lifting only in thin sheets when a breeze moved. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold stone. Nothing felt sharp or alive. Everything felt muffled. I noticed the breaks in the undergrowth early on. At first I brushed them off. Deer cut paths everywhere, and people wander where they should not. But these were straight in a way that bothered me. They did not weave around saplings or dip where the ground fell away. They went through brush like someone had pushed aside branches with purpose. Some were too narrow for an ATV and too wide for a single person walking normally. I stopped more than once to look closer. The edges of snapped stems were pale and fresh. No rot, no darkening. I told myself someone had camped nearby and moved on. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had in mind, a small rise above the creek where the ground stayed dry. I dropped my pack and walked the area the way I always did, checking for dead trees and loose limbs. That was when I found the fire ring. It sat tucked between two large oaks, stones arranged in a rough circle. The ashes were still gray and powdery, not washed out by rain. There was no trash, no cans, no foil, nothing careless. I could not see clear footprints, but the ground around it had been disturbed. Leaves were scuffed back to bare dirt. It did not look old. It did not look abandoned. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. The woods held steady. No birds called. The creek kept moving. I should have left then. I did not. I told myself people passed through all the time. I told myself I knew this place better than whoever had been there. I set up my tent facing downhill toward the creek and kept my gear tight and close. As the light faded, the fog thickened again, wrapping the trees so that the woods felt smaller. Sound carried strangely. The creek sounded closer than it was. Every stick snap felt right behind me. I ate without appetite and sat near the tent as the dark settled. That was when I heard something walking uphill from the creek. The steps were slow and uneven. One foot dragged slightly, scuffing leaves before lifting. The sound did not rush. It did not wander. It came straight up the slope toward where I sat, and then stopped just out of sight. I waited. My hands rested on my knees. I counted breaths without meaning to. For nearly an hour, nothing else happened. No cough, no shift of weight, just a creak in my own pulse. Then the smell reached me. It came in waves, thick and wrong. It reminded me of wet fur left too long in a closed space mixed with rot. I had smelled dead animals before. This was stronger. It carried warmth. My stomach tightened. I kept my head still and watched the trees. The fog thinned enough for me to see movement between trunks. A shape shifted, tall and narrow, rising upright for a few steps before dropping low again. It did not move like a deer. It did not move like a person walking normally. The outline broke apart in the fog, but the height stayed with me. Taller than any deer I had seen. The movement stopped and started testing the ground. I did not shine my light. I did not call out. I sat there until my legs ached and my jaw hurt from clenching. Eventually the smell drifted away. The steps moved off to the side, angling along the slope. The night grew colder. I crawled in my tent and lay awake until dawn, listening for any change. Nothing came close again. When morning light finally broke through the fog, it felt like relief and shame at the same time. I packed fast and moved down toward the creek to refill my bottle before leaving. That was when I saw the impressions in the mud near the bank. They were deep and wide, pressed in where the ground was soft. They did not look like hooves. They were not shaped like boots. The front was rounded, the edges uneven, with marks that looked like claws dug in for balance. Some prints showed a longer drag mark behind them, as if one leg did not lift cleanly. The spacing between them was wide, too wide for a person limping. I stood there longer than I wanted to, trying to make sense of it. I left early and did not go back to that stretch. I drove until my hands stopped shaking and pulled over on the side of the road. I sat there and breathed until the woods stopped feeling like they were closing in on me. For a long time, I did not talk about what I saw. I told myself fear had filled in the gaps. Grief does strange things to perception. Months later, after the edge had dulled, I started reading. I looked up wildlife reports from eastern Kentucky. Black bears have been moving back into the area for years. A few cases mentioned bears with mange, animals that lost fur and smelled strong from infection and decay. Mange could cause uneven movement and make a bear stand upright more often to relieve pressure on damaged skin. Bears could walk short distances upright when testing ground or scent. A large male could look taller than expected, especially through fog and trees. Claw marks in mud would not look like hooves or boots. Drag marks could come from injured limbs. I also learned about illegal camps deeper in the forest, people who moved often and left little behind. Some avoided trails and cut straight paths through brush. Some carried meat and hides that could rot. A person favoring a leg could move in the way I heard. A person wearing heavy gear could smell the way I smelled. But the impressions in the mud did not match boots. The depth and spread pointed to weight carried low and forward. In the end, the most likely answers settled in my mind without comfort. I had camped near an injured bear moving through its range, drawn to water and leftover scent from a recent fire ring. The animal had been curious or defensive, not aggressive. It had tested the slope, caught my scent, and moved on. The smell fit. The movement fit. The prints fit. Nothing supernatural was needed to explain it. What stayed with me was not mystery, but timing. I had gone out there raw and distracted, trusting old knowledge without paying attention to change. The woods had not meant me harm. They had simply reminded me that grief does not make you invisible and familiarity does not make you safe. I never went back to that stretch because I did not need to prove anything to myself. The place did not owe me peace. I found other ways to move and breathe and remember my father. When I think of that night now, it feels clear and contained. I was not hunted. I was not chosen. I crossed paths with something struggling to survive, and for one long hour, We both waited to see which way the other would go. My name is Aaron, and this happened in August of 2019 while I was working a seasonal forestry job in northern Maine. I had taken the position because it paid well for a few months and kept me outdoors. I had grown up hiking and hunting, and I trusted myself in the woods. The company owned a large tract of forest near the Canadian border, land that had been cut and replanted in sections for decades. My assignment that day was simple on paper. I was supposed to hike in, check boundary markers along a long stretch of property line, record their condition, and hike back out before dark. I carried a paper map folded and soft at the creases, a GPS unit clipped to my pack strap, and a company radio that worked only when it felt like it. I had water, food, and a light shelter in case something went wrong. I did not plan to use it. The weather was clear and warm, and I expected to be back at the truck by evening. The terrain was worse than I expected almost right away. Northern Maine woods are not gentle. The spruce and fir grow tight together, their lower branches stiff and sharp. The ground looks solid until you step on it and sink into moss or drop into a hole between rocks. Fallen trees lie hidden under needles and rot. Every step takes effort. Progress is slow in a way that does not show on a map. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had misjudged the distance. I was far deeper than I meant to be, and the sun was already angling low through the canopy. The GPS showed I was miles from the nearest road. I pushed on, focused on finishing my markers. That was when I started noticing the bones. The first pile sat near a fallen log. Small bones, bleached pale, stacked neatly against the wood. I assumed fox or coyote at first. Predators clean carcasses and leave remains behind. But as I moved on, I found more. Near a stump, at the base of a spruce. Always stacked, never scattered. The bones were stripped clean, no scraps of hide, no chew marks that looked rushed. Some piles had skulls placed on top, facing outward. It felt deliberate. I told myself scavengers reuse sites. I told myself I was tired and reading too much into it. Still, I marked the locations out of habit and kept moving. The woods stayed dense, the air thick with sap and damp soil. Sweat soaked my shirt and dried again. The radio stayed silent. When I checked it, static hissed back at me. As the light began to fade, I knew I would not make it out safely before dark. Hiking in those woods at night would be asking for injury. I chose a small open patch between trees, cleared debris, and set up my shelter. It was nothing more than a tarp rigged low with paracord. I ate without appetite and drank water slowly, aware of how quiet everything had become. After sunset, the forest changed. It did not fade in a night the way I was used to. It shut down. No insects buzzed. No leaves moved. Even the distant sounds of birds settling went away. The silence pressed against my ears. My headlamp beam felt weak, swallowed by the trees just a few yards out. That was when I heard movement. It came from beyond the edge of the light, slow and steady. Something pacing. It did not rush. It did not crash through brush. It moved carefully, circling wide, keeping its distance. Every few steps I heard a clicking sound, dry and sharp, like teeth tapping together. The rhythm stayed steady, patient. I stayed still, listening. My breathing felt loud. The smell reached me next. It was sharp and animal, heavy with musk and decay. It burned my eyes and caught in my throat. It smelled like a predator that had not eaten cleanly in a long time. I had smelled bears before. This was stronger, more focused. The pacing continued. It completed one slow circle, then another, always just outside the light. I shifted my headlamp once, sweeping the beam through the trees. The movement stopped immediately. The silence closed in again. When I held the light steady, the pacing resumed from another angle. Time stretched. I do not know how long I stayed there, crouched and listening. My muscles cramped. Sweat cooled on my skin. The clicking sound changed slightly at times, faster for a few steps, then slow again. I never heard breathing, but I felt watched. The smell thickened, then thinned, as if whatever was moved closer and then backed away. At some point, exhaustion took over. The movement drifted farther out. The silence loosened. I did not sleep so much as fade in and out, waking at every imagined sound and until gray light seeped through the trees. At dawn, the forest felt wrong in a different way. Birds returned slowly, cautious and scattered. I stepped out from under the tarp and saw the ground around my pack. The moss was pressed flat in several places. The impressions were large and deep, shaped like hands pressed hard into the earth. Long palms, stretched fingers, wider at the base than any human hand. Each impression was longer than my forearm. They circled the shelter the way the movement had circled me. I did not stay to study them. I packed fast, hands shaking, and started hiking out. Every sound made me flinch. I did not stop until I reached the road and saw my truck through the trees. Only then did my legs give out. I sat on the ground and breathed until the world steadied. I reported what I found when I returned to the office. I turned to my notes and my GPS data. The reaction was flat. Bones were blamed on predators. The impressions were dismissed as distorted bear tracks in soft moss. The smell was chalked up to rutting animals and rot. No one followed up. No one wanted to log an incident that complicated things. Over the next 2 weeks, I kept thinking about what I had seen and smelled. I read about wildlife in the region. Black bears were common, especially large males that moved alone. Bears could strip carcasses clean and sometimes cache bones. They could stand and walk upright for short distances. Their forepaws, pressed into moss, could look like hands, especially when spread for balance. A bear with dental issues or jaw damage could make clicking sounds when it moved. An animal with infection or poor diet could smell strong enough to sting the eyes. The explanation fit enough to stop the questions, but not enough to quiet the memory. What stayed with me was not fear of something unknown, but the sense of being evaluated, measured, and then left alone. The animal did not rush me. It did not bluff charge. It paced and watched and decided I was not worth the risk. I quit that job 2 weeks later. I did not tell anyone the real reason. I said the pay was not worth the isolation. That was true. I still work outdoors now and then, but I do not go alone into deep forest anymore. I learned that day how thin the line is between routine work and being just another set of bones stacked near a log, clean and quiet, waiting for someone else to pass by and tell themselves it all makes sense. I went into the woods alone because I needed time away from people and noise. It was late September, still warm during the day, but cold enough at night to make the air feel sharp. I picked a stretch of state forest I had been to before, nothing remote or wild in a dramatic way. Just miles of trees, old logging trails, and small creeks cutting through low ground. I parked at a gravel pull-off used by hunters and hikers, locked my car, and walked in with a full pack. I planned to stay 2 nights, maybe 3 if I felt like it. The first few miles were calm. Leaves were starting to turn, mostly yellow with patches of dull red. The ground was dry, and every step made a soft crunch. I followed an old trail that barely counted as one anymore. It was wide enough to tell machines had once passed through, but grass and saplings had taken it back. I saw no fresh boot prints, no trash, no signs anyone had been around recently. That was part of the reason I chose it. I set up camp near a shallow creek where the bank flattened out. I kept everything simple. Small tent, food hung in a tree, fire low and controlled. As the sun went down, the woods went quiet in a way that felt heavy instead of peaceful. No wind, no insects, no distant road noise. Just stillness. I told myself it was normal. Woods do that sometimes. That night passed without anything strange. I slept light, waking up often, but that happens when I'm alone. In the morning, I noticed something off near the creek. The mud on the bank had marks in it that were not animal tracks. They were long, shallow drags, like something heavy had been pulled through. I assumed it was a deer carcass dragged by scavengers, or maybe someone had been fishing and moved gear around. I did not think much of it. I spent the day hiking deeper, following the creek upstream. The farther I went, the more signs I saw that did not sit right with me. Pieces of black plastic caught in branches. A rusted metal barrel half buried in leaves. Old rope tied around a tree and cut short. None of it looked new, but none of it belonged there either. The forest felt used in a way that did not match how empty it was. By late afternoon, I started feeling watched. Not in a dramatic way, just a steady awareness that made me turn around more often. Each time, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I blamed it on being alone too long and headed back to camp before dark. When I got close, I knew immediately something had changed. The area around my tent looked disturbed. Leaves were crushed flat where I had not walked. My food bag was still hanging untouched, but the rope had been retied lower than I left it. The knot was different. I stood still for a long time, listening. I heard nothing. I checked my tent. Nothing was missing. My pack was where I left it, but the zipper was not fully closed. I knew for a fact I had closed it. I'm careful about that. I went through my things slowly. Everything was there. Nothing taken. That somehow made it worse. I did not light a fire that night. I ate cold food and sat in the dark longer than I should have, trying to hear movement. The woods stayed quiet again, too quiet. When I finally went into my tent, sleep did not come. Every small sound fell sharp, leaves shifting, a branch snapping far away. My body stayed tense. Sometime after midnight, I smelled something strange. It was chemical, sharp, not like smoke or rot. It came in short waves, stronger and then gone, like something drifting on the air. I stayed still, holding my breath. The smell returned, stronger. My eyes watered. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear voices, but I sensed movement nearby, slow and careful. Something brushed against the side of my tent, light enough to seem accidental, but steady enough to feel deliberate. The fabric pressed inward for a second, then released. I froze. My heart hammered so hard I felt sick. Nothing else happened after that. The smell faded. The pressure on the tent did not return. I stayed awake until the sky lightened. At dawn, I packed fast. I did not care about being quiet anymore. I just wanted out. When I stepped away from my campsite, I saw boot prints in the soft ground near the creek. Not fresh enough to be wet, but clear. They led toward the trees, not toward any trail. As I followed my way back, I noticed more signs. Pieces of glass hidden under leaves. A shallow pit covered with branches. Another barrel, this one split open, with stains on the inside that made my stomach turn. The chemical smell came back, faint but steady. About a mile from my car, I found a small clearing I had not seen before. It was hidden from the trail, surrounded by thick brush. In the center was a rough structure made of tarps and scrap wood. No fire, no smoke, no people. Just the smell, stronger now, and the quiet hum of insects drawn to something rotting nearby. I did not go closer. I turned around slowly and took a wide route back, cutting through thick undergrowth until my legs burned. I did not stop until I saw my car through the trees. When I reached it, I saw scratches on the driver's side door, long and uneven, like someone had dragged metal across it. My tires were intact, the doors unlocked. Inside, nothing was touched. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police station. I told them what I saw without adding fear or guesses. Just facts. Barrels, chemical smell, camp disturbed, structure in the woods. They took it seriously. A few days later, I heard through a local news page that authorities found an illegal drug operation deep in that forest. It had been abandoned in a hurry, but signs showed someone had still been nearby when I was there, watching and waiting for me to leave. They said I was never in danger. That was easy for them to say after the fact. I know better. Whoever was out there had gone through my camp, touched my things, stood close enough to my tent for me to smell what they were working with. They chose not to confront me, but that choice could have gone the other way. I do not camp alone anymore. I still go into the woods, but only places with marked trails and people around. I learned that quiet does not always mean empty, and isolation can hide things that do not want to be seen. That trip ended with me getting out safely, but the memory stays sharp because it showed me how close normal life can get to something dangerous without any warning at all. I went into the woods because I trusted the place more than I trusted people at that point in my life. It was early November, after most campers had stopped going out and hunters had not fully arrived yet. The weather was cold, but not freezing, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones slowly. I chose a large stretch of public forest several hours from my home, far enough that I felt disconnected, but not so far that it felt reckless. I had hiked parts of it before during summer trips, and always seemed calm, almost boring. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked at a dirt turnout beside a locked service gate. The gate blocked vehicle access to an old maintenance road that ran several miles into the forest. I stepped around it and started walking. The road was cracked and broken, weeds growing through the center, leaves piled thick along the edges. The trees were tall and thin, their branches mostly bare, and the sky above was a flat gray. The air smelled like wet soil and decaying leaves. I walked for over an hour before leaving the road. I followed a narrow game trail, downhill, toward a creek I remembered from a previous trip. The woods grew denser as I moved away from the road. Fallen branches crisscrossed the ground, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. Every sound felt loud in the quiet. My breathing, my boots, the fabric of my jacket brushing against branches. I reached the creek just before sunset. The water moved slowly, dark and shallow, with patches of ice forming along the edges. I set up my tent on a small rise a short distance away, far enough to avoid flooding, but close enough to access water. Everything felt normal. I cooked a simple meal, cleaned up, and sat watching the light fade through the trees. The woods grew still in that heavy way they do when night settles in fully. That first night passed without anything obvious happening. I slept in short bursts, waking often, but nothing disturbed me. In the morning, I noticed the creek level had dropped slightly overnight, leaving a band of wet mud along the bank. In that mud were marks that made me stop. They were not animal tracks. They looked like boot prints, but distorted, as if the person had been dragging their feet or carrying something heavy. The prints did not come from upstream or downstream. They appeared near the water and disappeared into the trees. I told myself they were old. I told myself someone else had been there before me, and I just hadn't noticed. I packed a day bag and went exploring anyway, following the creek upstream. The forest felt different in daylight, brighter but also more exposed. I kept finding small things that fell out of place. A length of wire wrapped around a sapling. A torn piece of tarp caught high in a branch. A broken plastic crate half buried in leaves. None of it was new, but none of it belonged. By mid-afternoon, the sky darkened and the temperature dropped. I turned back toward camp. As I got closer, I noticed the sound of the creek seemed louder than before, as if the surrounding forest had gone quiet again. When my campsite came into view, my stomach tightened. My tent was standing, but the area around it looked disturbed. Leaves were pushed aside in wide arcs. My pack was not where I left it. I found my pack a few feet away, leaning against a tree. The pockets were open. Nothing was missing, but things had been moved. My flashlight was no longer clipped where I kept it. My spare socks were pulled out and stuffed back in poorly. Someone had gone through it slowly, carefully. I stood there for a long time listening. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. Just the creek and the wind picking up through the bare branches. I considered leaving then, but daylight was already fading, and the thought of hiking back to my car in the dark through unfamiliar terrain felt worse than staying put. I moved my camp slightly, shifting my tent closer to a cluster of thick trees and clearing the ground again. I kept my headlamp on even while eating. I did not light a fire. I felt exposed, like the open space invited attention. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before, pressing on my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. That night was worse. I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard movement near the creek. Slow, uneven sounds, like someone stepping carefully to avoid noise, but failing to do so completely. The sounds would stop for long stretches, then resume closer. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sounds never reached my tent, but they circled the area, moving back and forth, never committing to one direction. At some point, a sharp smell drifted through the air. It was not natural, not with smoke or rot. It burned my nose and made my eyes sting. It came and went with the breeze. I buried my face in my sleeping bag and waited for morning. When daylight finally came, the forest looked ordinary again, but the feeling did not leave. I packed up immediately. As I took my tent down, I noticed a long scrape on one of the stakes, fresh and deep. Something hard had hit it during the night. I checked the ground and saw more boot prints, clearer now, circling the campsite in a wide loop. I started hiking out, moving fast. I did not follow my previous route. I stayed high on the slope, keeping the creek in sight, but not approaching it. After about an hour, I smelled the chemical odor again, stronger this time. I slowed down and scanned the area ahead. That was when I saw it. A crude structure tucked into a shallow ravine, barely visible from above. Plastic sheeting stretched between trees. Old boards nailed together. Blue barrels stacked near the back. The ground around it was stained dark, and the smell was overwhelming. I did not step closer. I did not need to. I knew I had stumbled into something that did not want attention. I backed away slowly, then turned and pushed through the trees as hard as I could. Branches tore my clothes. My hands burned from the cold and the effort. I did not stop until I reached the old service road. When my car finally came into view, I felt relief hit me, so hard my legs shook. As I unlocked the door, I noticed something that made my chest tighten again. Mud smeared across the rear bumper. A single handprint, half wiped away, dried and cracked. I drove straight to the nearest town and reported everything. Days later, I learned that the forest had been searched. Authorities found evidence of an illegal operation involving chemical dumping and manufacturing. The site I saw had been active until very recently. They believed someone had still been using the area when I was there, watching from a distance, waiting for me to leave on my own. Nothing ever came of it beyond that. No arrest that I heard about. No clear answers. But I know what I experienced. I know someone went through my things, circled my camp, stood close enough for me to hear and smell them in the dark. I still hike, but I stay on marked trails now. I avoid places that feel forgotten. That trip taught me that the woods are not empty just because they feel quiet, and that sometimes the most frightening things out there are not trying to scare you at all. They're just hoping you never realize how close they really are. I went into the woods for a short solo hike to check an old trail I used to run every fall. It was mid-October, cold enough that my breath showed in the mornings, but not cold enough for snow. The forest was part of a public wildlife area that almost nobody visited anymore because the main access road had washed out years earlier. The trail was still on old maps, but it had not been maintained in a long time. I like places like that because they felt untouched, quiet, and predictable if you paid attention. I parked along a gravel shoulder where the pavement ended. There were no other vehicles, no footprints, no signs of recent activity. The trees were tall and thin, mostly oak and pine, with leaves piled deep on the ground. Every step made a dry, crunching sound. I remember noticing how empty it felt. Not peaceful empty, but hollow, like the forest was holding its breath. The first mile was easy. The trail was faint but still readable if you knew what to look for. Old blaze marks on trees, a shallow groove worn into the soil. Broken branches cut clean years ago. I moved at a steady pace, stopping now and then to take in the smell of damp leaves and rot. The air felt heavy, even though it was cool. There was no wind. About an hour in, I saw something that did not belong. A section of the trail ahead had been scraped clean down to bare dirt, like someone had dragged something heavy across it over and over. Leaves were pushed aside in wide arcs. The soil was packed flat and dark. It did not look fresh, but it was not old either. I crouched down and looked closer. There were marks that looked like boot treads, but they were scuffed and incomplete, as if someone had walked back and forth many times without caring where they stepped. I stood up and listened. No birds, no insects, just my own breathing and the faint sound of leaves shifting somewhere far off. I told myself it was nothing. Hunters, maybe someone hauling equipment. Still, I felt the need to keep moving, like stopping there too long would be a mistake. The trail dipped into a low area where the ground stayed wet year-round. The smell changed there. It was sharp and sour, mixed with decay. I saw more signs of disturbance. Broken saplings, mud smeared along tree trunks at waist height. Long strands of torn fabric caught on thorns. They were faded and dirty, the color impossible to tell. The deeper I went, the worse the feeling became. It felt like the woods were closing in, not physically but mentally. Every sound felt important. Every shadow pulled my attention. I checked my phone and saw I had no signal, which I expected, but it still made my stomach tighten. I reached a small clearing where the trail should have split. One branch went uphill toward a ridge. The other dropped down toward a creek. The trail markers were gone. In their place were strips of bright plastic tape tied to branches. They were not placed to guide anyone. They were tied at random heights, some low, some high, twisting in the still air. The colors stood out in a way that hurt my eyes. I did not want to touch them. I stepped around them and followed the downhill path, trusting my memory of the area. The ground grew softer. My boots sank into mud with each step. The smell grew stronger, chemical and rotten at the same time. I started noticing trash. Empty cans crushed flat, food packaging torn open, a cracked hard hat lying upside down, filled with rainwater and dead insects. I heard a sound then that made me stop. It was a slow, dragging noise, far away but steady, not rhythmic like walking, more like something being pulled across the ground. It stopped when I stopped. I waited, holding my breath. After a long moment, it started again, closer this time. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, careful not to rush. The sound continued, matching my movement. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it stopped. That was when fear settled in fully, heavy, and cold. I picked up my pace. The trail did not look the same anymore. Turns I did not remember appeared. Trees leaned at strange angles. The light seemed dimmer, even though it was still afternoon. I realized then that I had gone farther off the real trail than I thought. I saw the structure ahead before I smelled it. A low frame made of rough wood and tarp, hidden between trees. The tarp was dark and stained. The ground around it was churned into mud, trampled flat. There were tools scattered everywhere. Shovels, buckets, a wheelbarrow tipped on its side. The smell was overpowering now, thick and metallic. I froze. I knew I was somewhere I should not be. I started backing away, slowly, my eyes scanning every shadow. That was when I heard footsteps clearly behind me. Heavy, controlled, not rushed. I ran. I did not think. I did not plan. I ran downhill, slipping and stumbling, branches tearing at my arms and face. I could hear the footsteps behind me, not chasing, not yelling, just following. They stayed the same distance away, no matter how fast I moved. That scared me more than anything else. I fell hard near the creek, knocking the air out of my lungs. I rolled into the shallow water, soaking my clothes. I got up and kept moving, following the water downstream, splashing loudly, not caring anymore. The footsteps stopped. I did not stop. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs shaking, my hands numb from cold. The forest slowly changed. The ground firmed up. The trail became clearer. I recognized landmarks. When I finally saw the edge of the trees and the gray line of the road, my vision blurred with relief. My car was still there. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking until my breathing slowed. I drove away without looking back. A week later, I saw a news report about an illegal dumping site found in that wildlife area. The report mentioned hazardous waste, makeshift shelters, and signs of people living there for months. It said the site had been cleared and the area closed off. I never went back. What stays with me is not the site itself, but the way I was followed. Whoever was there did not panic. They did not rush. They did not need to. They knew the woods. They knew I was lost. And they knew I would leave if they let me see just enough to be afraid.